At a high-level summit meant to unite Africa, President Tinubu tried to publicly humiliate Ibrahim Traoré, calling him just a boy in uniform. But Traoré didn't respond with words. He responded with silence and a document that changed everything. By the time the cameras caught on, a new alliance had already been signed, outside the system, beyond the spotlight. And one line, spoken when no one was supposed to hear, echoed across the continent. Real power doesn't shout, it echoes. If you're still here, you're part of that echo. Subscribe now, and let your voice be part of this movement. Rain tapped gently on the tinted windows of Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport as a sleek black military SUV rolled across the tarmac, its presence commanding but quiet. No sirens, no entourage, just a single vehicle moving through fog and drizzle like it had every right to ignore protocol. Inside sat Ibrahim Traoré, dressed in full military uniform, his posture relaxed but alert. His boots struck the wet ground with unhurried rhythm as he stepped out, the rain beading across. His shoulders not a single flinch. He didn't look around for welcome signs or cameras. He didn't need to. This wasn't a state visit for handshakes and photo ops. This was something else, a statement, and the silence around him only confirmed it. As he entered the airport's private reception lounge, no one spoke. His team followed, Defense Minister Kassoum Coulibaly and Economic Advisor Ibrahim Balam, men who knew what silence could mean when it came from someone who usually speaks through action. One airport officer nodded respectfully but said nothing. The air carried the scent of wet concrete and cold steel, but beneath it, there was something heavier. Tension, the kind that clings to suits and blindsides the unprepared. The summit in Abuja had been branded as a moment of unity, a grand attempt to stitch together fractured relations across West Africa. The banners said harmony, the pamphlets said cooperation. But the whispers behind closed hotel doors told another story. Nigeria under President Tinubu was pressuring for fresh sanctions against Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. To some, it looked like diplomacy, but to others, it looked like control disguised in a handshake. Traoré knew this game well, and he came, not to play it, but to rewrite it. Inside the Hilton Conference Center, polished marble reflected the gleam of designer shoes and ambition. Leaders in tailored suits exchanged smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Laughter echoed too loud in corners that usually whispered secrets. Traoré moved through it all without a word, the hum of conversations lowering slightly wherever he walked. Some looked away. Others nodded cautiously, unsure of how to acknowledge the presence of someone they had tried to isolate. As they approached the summit chamber, Traoré's foreign affairs minister leaned close and spoke in a low voice. They say Tinubu called you a boy with a gun and no table to sit at. Traoré's steps didn't falter. He didn't blink. Then we build our own table, he replied, eyes forward. The room they entered next was elegance wrapped in control, gold trim on the walls, flags from member nations lined behind the grand mahogany table. Each seat bore a brass plate, each plate a name, each name a game piece. The table was set, but not for everyone. Delegates from Guinea and Mali offered brief nods, quiet but meaningful. Nigeria's representatives? They stared past him, eyes fixed on notes. They weren't reading or screens that weren't on. The message was clear. You're here, but not welcome. President Tinubu stood in the center of it all, surrounded by polished suits, soft chuckles, and the kind of artificial confidence that often precedes something rehearsed. He didn't acknowledge Traoré, didn't offer a nod, not even a glance. Instead, he turned to a nearby French delegate and laughed louder, his voice echoing through the chamber like a signal flare. But across the room, Traoré stood still. Not stiff, not tense, just present. As if his silence weighed more than the laughter that tried to drown it. He leaned toward his aide and whispered, "This summit won't be remembered for what is said, but for what is revealed." The hum of translation headsets began. The rustle of paper followed. One by one, leaders took their seats, each motion deliberate, each glance a signal. Everyone watching, no one admitting it. Tinubu adjusted his glasses and leaned forward to the microphone. "Leadership," he began, voice smooth, warm, but eyes sharp, "is not for boys in uniforms playing revolution. It belongs to those who have earned it through age, through experience, and through results." The room didn't gasp. That would have been honest. Instead, it shifted, slightly, uncomfortably. In the Nigerian corner, a smirk, a stifled laugh. And one aide, just loud enough, muttered, "Wow." Traoré didn't move. His hands remained clasped, his expression unreadable, but his eyes locked directly onto Tinubu's. No blink, no reaction, just a silent, deliberate stare, the kind that makes time stretch, and something in that silence cracked. Tinubu hesitated. Not visibly, not publicly. Just enough for his fingers to reach for the glass of water he didn't need. His voice dipped. The rhythm of his speech wavered for a heartbeat, but it was enough. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, unforgiving, and it didn't wait. Across the room, Mali's Simago leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. Guinea's Dambuya narrowed his eyes. The insult hadn't just targeted Traoré. It had challenged every soldier who had traded the battlefield for a ballot box, every man who'd stood without permission to protect his people. This was personal. And while reports resumed and statistics were read out loud like scripts, the real conversation had already begun. In glances, in clenched fists under the table, in the tension that now pulsed beneath every polite phrase. Outside, the press waited for headlines. Inside, the story was being written in silence. Later that evening, chandeliers glowed above crystal glasses as delegates dined and posed. Imported wine flowed freely. Toasts were made. But Ibrahim Traoré did not attend the dinner. He walked instead, down the quiet halls of the Hilton, his steps echoing soft against the carpeted silence. He passed by empty lounges, unopened gift baskets, and tired staff waiting for moments to end. He had no need for applause, no hunger for spectacle. Defense Minister Coulibaly found him near the executive wing. "Let me answer him tomorrow," he said. "Let me make the statement he won't forget." But Traoré shook his head. "We don't speak," he said. "We build." And with that, he continued past the elevators, not toward his room, but toward the quieter floors, where no press had been allowed. Behind sealed doors, in suites reserved for Guinea and Mali's delegations, the lights were low, but the minds were sharp. Amy Goita greeted him with a firm handshake. "We heard what happened," he said. "Tinubu's mouth moves faster than his policy." Traoré nodded once. "Then we move faster than both. No slogans, no press, no podiums, just ideas, shared mineral routes, independent communication channels, a defensive pact." Maps were spread. On tables, hands moved across borders, not to divide, but to connect. And every stroke of a pen became a brick in a foundation no one outside that room was ready for. That night, the city of Abuja sparkled like nothing had changed. But behind those closed doors, Africa had taken a quiet breath and exhaled a decision. By 2 a.m., Traoré returned to his suite. His ministers were still awake, standing, waiting. He looked at them calmly. "No retaliation," he said. "Not tomorrow, not ever. We are not here to respond to disrespect. We are here to outgrow it." The statement hit harder than any speech could have, and by morning, the summit would never be the same. By morning, the air inside the ECOWAS chamber felt different, heavier. Delegates sipped coffee and skimmed through their printed agendas, pretending not to notice the weight that had settled on the room since the previous day. No one brought up the insult. No one needed to. It hovered there, unspoken, wrapped in silence more commanding than words. Tinubu's jab had landed, but it had not drawn blood. Instead, it had exposed something deeper, the kind of restraint that only comes from those who don't need to prove anything. Ibrahim Traoré entered right on time. No entourage, no performance, just presence. He took his seat quietly, this time not at the main table, but at the far end of the chamber. A deliberate choice. He knew exactly where not to sit. The seat of power isn't always at the center. Sometimes it's where the echo of truth travels undisturbed. Tinubu, seated near the front, wore the same smile he had the night before. He adjusted his tie, raised a hand in greeting to a passing delegate, and leaned toward a French ambassador with another light-hearted joke. Laughter followed. But the eyes around the table didn't follow with the same loyalty. Some were watching. Something else now, or rather someone. Traoré didn't speak. He was deep in a quiet conversation with South Sudan's energy minister and Guinea-Bissau's finance envoy. It looked ordinary, but those close enough to hear knew something else was happening. A current was moving beneath the surface, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but builds pressure until everything shifts. Then came the second session. Midway through the agenda, Traoré was granted the floor. He didn't stand immediately. When he did, it was slow, composed. He placed both hands on the table before him and let a moment of stillness settle before speaking. Sovereignty, he said softly, is not a topic for debate. It is a foundation. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. His French accent, sharp yet unshaken. Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger. We are not breaking from Africa. We are breaking from control. No dramatic pause, no raising of volume. Just truth, plain and level as a blade on marble. From the central table, Tinubu shifted. His chair creaked. His smile faded for half a second. Then he leaned forward toward his microphone and said, with almost too much calm, "Let the adults speak." It was loud enough to carry, not a whisper, not a joke, a slice. There were no audible gasps, but the room didn't need them. One aide near the back whispered under his breath, "Did he really say that?" Cameras zoomed in, and once again all eyes turned to Traoré. He didn't react. Not with a look, not with a word. He closed the binder in front of him, nodded once, and sat back down. His ministers sat tense, fists clenched beneath the table, breathing held, waiting for a sign. But none came, because that was the sign: restraint, precision, power not shown, but felt. And in that silence, something irreversible happened, not in politics, but in perception. Across the room, Mali's delegation straightened their posture. Guinea's ministers exchanged glances. Chad's observers leaned forward. The room was no longer focused on who was speaking. It had shifted to who wasn't. When the moderator called the next speaker, the tone had changed. The rhythm of diplomacy had been interrupted, and no one quite knew how to restore it. Behind the chamber walls, the corridors buzzed. Burkina Faso's defense minister Kassim Koulibaly cornered Traoré just outside the lounge. "He wants a reaction," he whispered. "Let him keep talking," Traoré replied. That evening, under crystal chandeliers, Tinubu hosted a formal dinner. Laughter echoed again. Toasts were raised. Photographers clicked away. But in another part of the hotel, far from glass walls and crystal forks, a small, dimly lit room came alive with conversation. Traoré sat at a table with Doumbouya of Guinea and Goita of Mali. There were no speeches, no declarations, just strategy. A single notepad sat between them. Lines were drawn, borders revisited, plans laid out, routes for mineral trade, military alignment, a new communication network, all of it outside ECOWAS. No one asked for permission. That was the point. "We move fast," Goita said. "We move quietly," Doumbouya added. "And we don't stop," Traoré finished. Elsewhere in the Hilton, music played, lights flashed, deals were paraded. But in room 409, something far more powerful was being built, without an audience. By midnight, the documents were drafted. By 2 a.m., they were signed. And by morning, everything would change. At 8 a.m., as most delegates still loitered in hallways with coffee and gossip, a quiet buzz spread. Traoré had requested a special session, not in the main hall, not on camera, just a briefing room, plain, functional, out of the spotlight. By 9, it was full. Guinea, Mali, Niger, Chad, South Sudan, even observers from Algeria sat quietly. The Nigerian delegation arrived last, confused, unprepared. Tinubu was absent. He had sent his trade minister in his place. At the head of the table stood Traoré. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He opened a plain black folder, pulled out 3 signed documents, placed them on the table. "This," he said, "is not a speech. It is a decision." Heads leaned forward, eyes scanned. It was a new trade pact between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea. It included mutual defense, independent transport routes, and economic cooperation, all outside ECOWAS. No French banks, no foreign oversight, no Abuja or Accra involvement. The Nigerian trade minister stood up, stunned. "You didn't consult ECOWAS," he said. Traoré looked him in the eye. "ECOWAS didn't consult us when they sanctioned our survival." Silence. No one spoke, no aid moved, no one even checked their phones. Outside, the summit carried on, but inside that room, something else had arrived. Power, real, quiet, chosen. Minutes later, an aide burst into Tinubu's suite, pale and breathless. "Sir, it's done. They signed, without us." Tinubu stood. The room spun. What did they sign? The aide couldn't speak, but the news headline already flashed on his phone. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea launch independent trade pact outside ECOWAS. Stormed out of the suite, but it was already too late. In the press hall, microphones were being set. Journalists checked cameras, and in front of them stood 4 men, Traoré, Goita, Doumbouya, Chiani from Niger. No slogans, no flags, no noise, just one quiet voice. "We are not here to challenge," Traoré said. "We are here to continue." With dignity, flashbulbs flickered, ministers whispered, Tinubu's aides looked lost. This wasn't rebellion. It was evolution, not forged in fury, but built in silence. Tinubu wasn't just late. He was no longer at the center of the room. And for a man used to being watched, that absence cut deeper than any speech ever could. Behind the heavy doors of the private leadership session, cameras were off, microphones unplugged, and press credentials left outside. What remained in the room was raw power, the kind that didn't need to perform anymore. Presidents, prime ministers, ministers of defense and trade, all seated in silence, a silence that didn't settle, but pressed. President Tinubu sat still, hands gripping the carved edge of the oak table. His eyes were fixed, not on Traoré, but on the document still fresh in his mind. Signed, sealed, done. He hadn't even known the meeting had taken place. Across from him sat Ibrahim Traoré, composed, still in uniform, boots polished but worn, his face unreadable, his body relaxed. The contrast was striking, one man cracking under the weight of a disrupted order, the other centered in a storm of his own making. Tinubu leaned forward. "Who do you think you are?" he asked sharply. "You embarrass this union. You defy order. You insult every principle ECOWAS was built on." Several ministers looked down at their notepads. Some shifted awkwardly in their chairs. Others stole glances toward Traoré, curious to see if he would finally snap, finally answer, finally meet fire with fire. But Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't blink. After a long pause, he spoke. "I'm a soldier," he said quietly, "who became a president, not the other way around." The sentence landed like thunder in a vacuum. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then came the sound of a chair creaking as Mali's delegate shifted in agreement. Guinea's foreign minister tapped a pen once firmly on the table. Tinubu stepped back slightly, trying to keep his face neutral. "You don't understand diplomacy," he muttered. Traoré looked at him again, calm, direct. "No," he said, "I understand sacrifice. That's the difference." Those words carried weight, not just in the room, but in the memories of every leader present. Memories of villages abandoned, families displaced, soldiers buried without medals, while foreign contracts were signed in air-conditioned boardrooms. Sacrifice wasn't just a word, it was a currency, and Traoré had paid in full. The moderator cleared his throat, attempting to move the discussion forward. But the air in the room had shifted again. Words were spoken, but their edges were dull. Even formal updates sounded hollow. What had just been said now framed everything else. When the doors finally opened and the leaders walked out into the hallway, journalists scrambled to capture photos. But the expressions on those faces weren't polished anymore. They were thinking, processing, comparing, and they were looking at Traoré differently now, not as the youngest, not as the quietest, but as the one who didn't flinch. Back in the main hall, papers shuffled, translation headsets clicked, and the moderator offered thanks to all for their participation. People began to prepare for departure. Most believed. The key moments had already passed, but they hadn't, as the final agenda point was read and the room began to relax. One microphone, unnoticed, still live, picked up a sentence, just one. Traoré, leaning to one of his aides, unaware the Mick had caught it, said, "Africa doesn't need dominance. It needs dignity." It was soft, almost private, but a sound technician in the back froze. He looked up. He checked the feed. It had been recorded. Within minutes, the audio clip spread through the internal press chat. Then it leaked. By nightfall, it was everywhere. Projected on walls in Dakar by students, debated in Lagos cafes by young professionals, whispered in the alleyways of Ouagadougou, where street artists began painting murals of Traoré beside Sankara. The line wasn't shouted. It wasn't planned. It wasn't meant for the public, but that's why it mattered. It was truth without performance, and it struck a nerve across the continent. Even in Nigeria, something unexpected stirred. In Ibadan, a group of university students released an open letter. "Is this the kind of leadership we mock or the kind we need?" Radio callers debated the line, not with anger, but curiosity. In live streams, people compared Traoré's calm with Tinubu's noise. And the question shifted from, what did he say? To why did it matter so much? Traoré didn't respond. He didn't explain the line. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't need to. The microphone, the one that should have been off, had done what few speeches ever do. It had revealed something real. The next morning, journalists rushed to get their headlines in. Delegations packed up, leaders posed for last-minute photos, but one man, the man at the center of it all, slipped away. No flash, no ceremony, no statements. Ibrahim Traoré left the summit before sunrise. He exited not through the main lobby, but through the underground wing of the Hilton. A single black SUV rolled quietly through the fog toward the military air base. Inside, his ministers sat with him, not talking, just thinking, not because they were afraid, but because they respected what had just been done. The trade agreement had been signed, the balance had shifted, the summit had cracked open. But Traoré didn't wear victory on his face. He wasn't celebrating. His eyes didn't carry triumph. They carried clarity. As they reached the runway and the wheels of the SUV slowed to a halt, Traoré turned to his team and spoke, quietly, as always. "History," he said, "is not made at the podium. It's made when no one is clapping. The plane door closed behind him. No one captured the moment, but across Africa, people were still talking because real power doesn't beg for attention. It enters quietly, and when it leaves, the room isn't the same. The plane cut through the early morning sky, silent above the clouds. Inside, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone near the window, his eyes scanning nothing in particular. He wasn't reading reports. He wasn't reviewing headlines. He didn't need to. He already knew something had shifted, not in the room he left behind, but in the continent he had come to represent. On the ground, Africa was listening, and not in the way the world expected. There were no trending hashtags, no official press releases, no international debates on Western news channels, but in classrooms, in cafes, in quiet homes, that one sentence, spoken when no one was supposed. To be listening was already sparking something new. Africa doesn't need dominance. It needs dignity. By noon, a university in Bamako had projected the quote on their main library wall. In Ghana, student leaders began dissecting its meaning in informal forums, writing essays and articles without being asked. In Lagos, 3 different radio stations opened their lines to callers wanting to talk about the boy with no table. But the question they were asking had changed. It was no longer about what had been said at the summit. It was about what hadn't been said, and who had dared to say nothing. Tinubu's press team tried to regain momentum. That afternoon, a new statement was drafted. Carefully worded, measured, it stressed unity, collaboration, and respect for traditional leadership structures. But by the time it reached the press pool, it was already too late. The real story wasn't in the statement, it was in the silence. Traoré hadn't clapped back, he hadn't reacted. He hadn't even posted a photo, yet somehow he had cleared the room, not with noise, but with presence. At a private gathering in Niamey that evening, several ministers from ECOWAS nations met for a discreet dinner. It was meant to be casual, just to regroup. But the tone was anything but light. They'd all seen the footage, heard the line, felt the shift. A Senegalese diplomat said it aloud, the words clumsy in his mouth. I think the boy just made the rest of us look small. No one disagreed. Across the continent, something was breaking, but not falling apart. Rather, it was loosening. The grip of old power was slipping. The shape of African leadership was beginning to evolve, not through revolt, but through contrast. The leaders who once spoke over each other were now measuring their words. The ones who once sought the stage were now looking for the room behind it, because something about Traoré's stillness had redefined what strength looked like. Not long after, in the city of Bobo Dioulasso, a mural appeared, painted in silence, no permission, no media, just 2 figures, Thomas Sankara on the left and Ibrahim Traoré on the right. Between them, a small sentence, not louder, just truer. That same night, in the suburbs of Kano, an unlikely scene played out. A group of young Nigerians, activists, artists, students, came together under candlelight. They weren't protesting, they weren't shouting, they were reflecting. One of them, a law student named Farid, stood up and spoke softly. They called him a boy, he said. But which one of them stood taller? No one replied. They didn't need to. They understood the answer wasn't political, it was personal. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré had returned to his modest office in Ouagadougou. There were no parades, no celebrations, no declarations of victory. His first meeting, upon return, wasn't with generals or diplomats. It was with students, 15 of them, chosen not for their grades or family names, but for their voices. Writers, artists, coders, teachers in training. He sat with them for over 2 hours. No script, no cameras, just conversation. They asked him what it felt like to be insulted. On a global stage, he smiled, and faintly, It wasn't the insult that mattered, he said. It was what followed. They asked if he planned to respond publicly. I already did, he said. By doing something they didn't expect, I didn't. Need to win the argument. I needed to change the room. Word of that private meeting spread quickly, not through news, but through whispers. That's how movements begin, not from stages, but from circles. Tinubu, meanwhile, was facing something new. Silence in the wrong places. Where he once saw loyal nods, he now saw diverted eyes. Where applause once echoed, now came only quiet compliance. His ministers were still present, still aligned, but not in heart, not in tone. Something had changed. In one internal meeting, a frustrated Tinubu slammed a folder shut. They act like he gave a speech. He didn't even say anything. But he had, not in volume, in vision, and the room knew it. One of Tinubu's most senior advisors, a man who had been with him since before office, leaned forward and said quietly, "Sir, that's what made it worse. There was no comeback." To that, just silence. In the weeks that followed, ECOWAS would issue statements. There would be forums, conferences, think pieces, but the story the people were following wasn't in the headlines. It was in that single moment when one man stood still and let the storm pass around him. And when the dust settled, he was still, standing unshaken, unbothered, unexplained, not because he was the loudest, but because he understood something no insult could undo. That dignity is louder than dominance. There's a strange silence that follows when the world expects noise and gets truth instead. It's not empty. It lingers. It listens. And across Africa, that silence was speaking louder than any rally, any broadcast, or any fiery speech ever could. In the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, men who once debated football now debated politics, not in anger, but in curiosity. Children were asking who Thomas Sankara was, and teachers were dusting off old books with a spark they hadn't felt in years. In Kigali, students played the Traoré audio clip on classroom speakers. Some classes turned it into discussion, others into art. They weren't repeating slogans, they were building context. And in Accra, a poetry event meant for casual performance became something else entirely. One young girl, no older than 17, stepped onto a simple wooden platform, closed her eyes and said, "Let them laugh, let them point. We build in the quiet while they destroy with the noise." The room didn't clap. They just stood still. Tinubu's office, meanwhile, had grown colder. It wasn't just political opposition that pressed against him now. It was internal erosion. Eyes that once followed him with certainty now hesitated. Foreign allies were still smiling, but their messages came slower, more cautious, less personal. Even the headlines had shifted. Articles stopped focusing on the insult Traoré had received and started focusing on the legacy Tinubu had just built and broken. In a confidential meeting, his foreign advisor said something bold. "You should have never underestimated a man who chooses silence over applause." Tinubu waved it off, but deep inside, the words settled uncomfortably. He was learning what all loud men learn eventually. That volume does, not equal vision. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré remained exactly where he had been, calm, working, grounded. He didn't issue follow-up statements. He didn't thank the public. He didn't lean into the fame. In fact, he rejected 3 interviews from international media. "What should I explain?" he said quietly to his press secretary. "Silence isn't something you justify. It's something you earn." Instead, he focused on the work. The trade pact signed at the summit, it wasn't just symbolic, it was already being implemented. Trucks moved along newly opened routes between Mali and Burkina Faso. Communications between military forces began flowing securely through independent satellite relays. Guinea announced that its next fiscal budget would be adjusted to remove dependency on French oversight entirely. In the background, the pieces were moving, but something else was happening too. something harder to define. In homes across Togo, mothers began referencing Traoré's posture when correcting their sons. In churches in Benin, sermons spoke not of battle, but of dignity. And in music videos, graffiti, spoken word, a new aesthetic emerged. Clean, resolute, proud, not loud, not angry, just present. In Lagos, a short film appeared online, just 2 minutes long. No dialogue. A young boy sits in a classroom. A teacher mocks him for not answering loudly. He gets up, walks outside, and starts planting a tree. The final frame fades into black with the words, "Africa doesn't need dominance, it needs dignity." That video reached 2 million views in 4 days. And Traoré? He didn't even know it existed. Back in Burkina Faso, an old general once, skeptical of Traoré, came to visit him. "You've caused a lot of discomfort," he said gruffly. "You've confused the old men." Traoré looked at him and smiled. "Then it means we're moving forward." The general laughed, not out of mockery, but out of recognition. "You didn't win the summit," he said. "You changed what summits mean." That line stuck because that was the heart of it. Traoré didn't play the game better, he changed the rules. No one expected a soldier in boots to become a symbol. But that's how symbols are born, not from those who seek the stage, but from those who make the ground beneath it shift. Across the Atlantic, African diasporas began picking up the story. In Washington, D.C., a professor changed his African politics syllabus to include the Abuja Summit incident. In Paris, a protest banner hung outside a government building read, "Respect isn't owed, it's noticed. Traoré showed us how." And in Johannesburg, a cafe played the leaked mic audio on repeat, not as a looped soundbite, but as a meditation. It became something to sit with, to breathe through, to reflect on. Tinubu's inner circle began to tighten. He appeared less frequently. When he did, his speeches grew longer, but not sharper. Each line carried the weight of over-explaining. Each pause looked rehearsed. And no matter how many initiatives were announced, none felt rooted. Because leadership isn't about filling air, it's about shifting it. And Ibrahim Traoré had done just that by saying less than anyone else. The final proof came one evening. Quietly, a group of Nigerian youth, young, passionate, disillusioned, gathered at a community center. They weren't angry, they weren't marching, they were planning, and one girl, notebook in her hand, said it plainly. "We were raised to think strength is in sound, but now we know it's in stillness." There were no slogans that night, no flags, just a board full of ideas, because that's how leadership spreads, not through orders, but through examples, not the loudest voice, just the one that doesn't need to shout to be heard. It started without a name. No flags, no hashtags, no slogans shouted into megaphones. But it started. From the dusty courtyards of Cotonou to the lecture halls in Kigali, something new was rising, not with noise, but with gravity. The kind of shift you don't hear until it's everywhere. The kind of revolution that doesn't scream. It hums in the background and waits for you to notice you're already part of it. They called it the quiet revolution. Not in headlines, not on billboards, but in the way people were behaving. In schools across Burkina Faso, children began holding silence days, 1 hour each week, where no one was allowed to speak unless it truly mattered. Teachers watched, amazed, as students found new ways to communicate, with eyes, with presence, with patience, a lesson deeper than any written on a chalkboard. In markets, old men referenced Traoré not with cheers but with nods. In song lyrics, his name appeared not as a hero, but as a reminder, because what he had done wasn't grand, it was grounded. He didn't try to change Africa. He tried to remind it what it already was. Meanwhile, back in Nigeria, the corridors of power felt colder. Tinubu's advisors filtered through rooms with tight mouths and heavy steps. No one dared mention the name, but it hovered in conversations. Like smoke, reports kept landing on Tinubu's desk. A youth summit in Nairobi themed Lead Like Silence. A conference in Lusaka showing a 10-minute montage of Traoré's summit silence before each panel. A university in Senegal, renaming its student hall Dignité. Tinubu brushed them aside, at least in public. But in private, he began to push back harder. Longer speeches, more decrees, lavish televised appearances showing him shaking hands, inspecting troops, smiling beside CEOs. But the applause felt thin now, because people had heard something else. And something that didn't need a microphone. And even worse, they'd felt it. Traoré, meanwhile, was not celebrating. He refused national parades in his honor. He turned down foreign interviews. When asked by his own staff if he wanted to deliver a commemorative speech about the summit moment, he simply said, "The moment already spoke." But it wasn't that he was invisible. It was that he appeared exactly when he needed to, and then disappeared into action. He began quietly touring border villages that were once ignored. Not with an army, not even with news cameras. Just him, a few local engineers, and a small team of educators. They weren't giving orders, they were listening. In one village near the Niger border, an elder asked him, "Why are you here alone?" Traoré smiled. "Because that's how I arrived." The man nodded. The people gathered. They didn't chant, they didn't wave flags, they simply stood close, in silence. Because that's what you do when someone carries weight without raising their voice. In Mali, President Goïta began holding shorter cabinet meetings, less talk, more strategy. In Guinea, President Doumbouya started a new initiative called Presence First, a requirement that all ministers spend one day each week in rural areas, with no press, no statements, just presence. And in Senegal, a member of parliament stood up in session and said, "We used to think power meant controlling the room. Now we know sometimes it means changing it without saying a word." And what about ECOWAS? The alliance still stood, but something inside it had shifted. At the next ministerial roundtable, the seats were still polished, the banners still crisp, but the tone, subdued, measured, alert. And when Burkina Faso's delegation walked in, no one looked away this time. No one avoided eye contact. They watched. They listened, because the man they tried to dismiss had walked out stronger than ever, not because he had yelled, but because he hadn't. In his absence, the space he once stood in had become more powerful than the ones still speaking. That was the new language now. In Uganda, a painter unveiled a series titled Unspoken, canvases of empty chairs, quiet hallways, a lone figure standing in fog. In Namibia, a school principal renamed their leadership program Stillness and Strength. In Cape Town, a startup incubator launched a mentorship series called Build, Don't Boast. And slowly across the continent, a question began to take root in conversations from cabinet meetings to coffee shops. Who is really leading us? Not just politically, but culturally, emotionally, spiritually. Traoré's answer wasn't written in a manifesto. It was etched in his restraint. And because of that, more and more young Africans began to believe something radical, that you didn't need permission to lead, you just needed clarity. The revolution was happening, not in shouts, but in shifts, not in battles, but in behavior, not in speeches, but in stillness. And for the first time in years, leadership didn't look like someone pointing forward. It looked like someone standing still and letting the world move around them. They thought it would fade, that like all viral moments, this too would vanish, swallowed by the next crisis, the next headline, the next outrage. They counted on the world's short memory. They bet on the noise returning, but they underestimated the silence, and the silence remembered. Weeks had passed since the summit. Diplomatic circles returned to their routines. ECOWAS resumed planning sessions, Western envoys resumed their subtle pressures, and inside the corridors of old power, one question kept circling: why is this still growing? There were no protests, no marches, no loud leaders pushing an agenda, yet everywhere they looked, the shift was still unfolding. A Ghanaian news host opened her morning show with a reflection, not a report. We used to celebrate who speaks loudest, but now we wonder who's listening best. In Cameroon, a university dean quietly added post-colonial silence as power to his political philosophy syllabus. No announcement, just an addition. And in Nigeria, Tinubu's advisors grew restless. They tried everything: media counter-narratives, campaigns reframing the summit as misunderstood, highlight reels of Tinubu's past achievements, but none of it landed. The youth didn't argue back. They just ignored it because this revolution wasn't reactive. It was patient. Frustrated, Tinubu called an emergency meeting of senior strategists. "This man has said nothing," he shouted, "and yet we're losing ground." An aide dared to speak. Because sometimes silence is louder than leadership. No one laughed. That night, another leak surfaced, not from Traoré, but from inside ECOWAS. A transcript of a closed-door session where an anonymous minister admitted, "We no longer control the narrative. The people have chosen their own." It spread fast, and it became clear this wasn't about Traoré anymore. It was about what he represented. A mirror, a reminder, a movement that didn't belong to him, but had been sparked by him. And then came the backlash. Anonymous articles appeared online, accusing Traoré of secrecy, of inexperience, of naive idealism. Bots flooded comment sections. Critics demanded to know why he wasn't more public, more transparent, more accessible, but he didn't respond. His silence now wasn't just calm, it was calculated. He didn't post quotes. He planted schools. He didn't issue rebuttals. He laid power cables in rural villages, and when a reporter shouted a question at him during a public visit to a health clinic asking, "Why won't you speak to your critics?" he smiled and replied, "Because I didn't come here to echo them. I came to build." The clip went viral within an hour, not because of the answer, but because of the pause before it. That pause, heavy, thoughtful, earned, was the new sound of authority. In cities across Africa, young mayors and council members began adopting a new rule. No promises, only presence. In Togo, an entire budget planning meeting was held with no speeches, just charts, timelines, decisions. And in Ethiopia, a group of high school students started a silent leadership club. Their motto was simple: make noise with your actions, not your voice. The movement had passed the test. It had faced criticism, mockery, and coordinated media attacks, and still it grew, because it wasn't built on one man's personality. It was built on a principle no one could argue with. That real power doesn't perform, it produces. One day, while reviewing new development projects in Burkina Faso's northern provinces, Traoré received a short message from his foreign affairs director. It simply said, "They've started copying you." Attached was a video, Tinubu, during a televised conference, sitting silently for a moment before speaking. A long, deliberate pause. His advisors had begun coaching him to adopt Traoré's style. The calm, the stillness, the restraint. But something was missing, because you can copy the posture, but not the purpose. You can copy the tone, but not the trust. And so, what was meant to undermine him only reinforced the truth. That stillness without integrity is just silence. But stillness with purpose, that's power. The world began watching again, but this time not as spectators, as students. Across Europe, Africa Studies programs scrambled to add a Traoré case study. In Latin America, radio shows began drawing parallels to past revolutions born not in riots, but in resolve. And in Washington, D.C., a journalist wrote in a policy brief, "He's not redefining African leadership. He's reminding the world what it was always meant to be. They thought it was over. They thought the cameras would move on. They didn't realize this was never for the cameras. It was for the people who never had them, for the ones who lead their families, their communities, their countries. Not with slogans, not with shows, but with quiet strength. The kind of strength you don't see coming until it's everywhere. Long after the microphones were packed away, long after the chairs were stacked and the speeches forgotten, something remained. Not on paper, not in the headlines, but in the air. That unseen, undeniable shift. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself, but becomes the standard by which everything after is measured. Across Africa, things were no longer the same, and yet no declaration had been made, no banners flown, no revolutions televised. It was quiet, but it was real. In Burkina Faso, the streets were calm, not with apathy, but with purpose. People weren't waiting for announcements. They were starting projects. School walls were painted with quotes not from presidents, but from students. Clinics no longer waited for national funding. Communities were funding each other. Farmers began organizing their own routes to neighboring nations, using the trade pact Traoré had signed months earlier. In that silence, systems were shifting. In Nigeria, something more complex brewed. Tinubu's team kept trying. They ramped up media campaigns. They tried to reclaim the narrative, but even their supporters now spoke in tones more measured, more cautious, because whether they admitted it or not, the standard had been changed. Louder no longer meant stronger, and those who had watched the Abuja Summit now watched their own leaders differently, not with rebellion, with awareness. Tinubu gave a speech in Port Harcourt, 35 minutes long, policy-heavy, rehearsed. Applause followed, but it was thin. And just as he stepped off the podium, a young journalist muttered to her colleague, "Feels like a man trying to catch something that already moved past him." And she was right, because Traoré hadn't chased the spotlight. He'd let it pass him by, and in doing so, became the light everyone turned toward. Back in Ouagadougou, he remained distant from spectacle. He still refused interviews. He declined international awards. When asked to accept an honorary doctorate from a major Western university, he responded with a handwritten letter. "I thank you for the recognition, but I would rather we built real schools together than collect titles alone." The university printed the letter and framed it. In Dakar, murals kept appearing, but now not just of him, but of ordinary people beside him. A grandmother, a shoemaker, a nurse, a child holding a notebook, and beside each a single word. Presence, because that was the legacy, not one man, but what he unlocked in others, what he reminded them of, without shouting. That leadership wasn't found on platforms. It was built at ground level. One evening, as dusk settled over the presidential compound in Ouagadougou, Traoré sat alone on a bench overlooking the quiet skyline. His aide approached, holding a phone. He spoke softly. "Sir, there's a global forum in Nairobi. They want you to speak about dignity in modern leadership. The invitation is from 13 nations. Traoré didn't turn. He simply asked, "What's happening in Sector 9? The aide blinked. "Sector 9, sir." "Yes. The irrigation project, the one with the broken wells. They're behind schedule." He nodded. "Then I know where I'm needed." The aide didn't press. He understood, because that was Traoré's stage. Not the world's podium, but a broken village pump, a rusted truck, a girl without school shoes. That's where he showed up. That's where his voice mattered most. Not because he made grand speeches, but because he made small moments sacred. And quietly across the continent, people followed that model. Young leaders stopped rehearsing and started listening. Ministers stopped pointing and started standing beside. And communities that once waited began moving, without permission, without noise, but with dignity. One evening in Nairobi, at the very forum Traoré declined, a speaker closed his remarks with a simple statement. The most powerful leader in Africa right now isn't here, and that's exactly why he is. The crowd stood, not for applause, but because they felt it. Across the ocean, somewhere in a remote province, a child pointed to a passing SUV. "Is that him?" she asked. "No," her father replied, "but he's probably walking somewhere nearby. You won't hear him coming. You'll just know when he's there. Because some power doesn't travel with noise, it travels with presence, and when it leaves the room, you don't forget what it left behind. Not a speech, not a slogan, but a standard, a reminder that real leadership walks quietly, and when it does, the whole continent listens.